A local girl says it was just a prop, but the death list she wrote with the names of classmates at Lakewood Local Middle School in Hebron not only got her suspended, it led to an investigation.
Parents on edge tonight after a so-called hit list turned up at a local middle school.
Officials at Griswold Middle School say they know who the list came from and they alerted parents. But in this day and every age, every threat is taken seriously.
Last Friday, Danielle and Eric Charest say their 15-year-old daughter came home from Nashua High School North scared after her name was discovered on a threatening list.
I think the mystery shrouding this is what's causing the alarm to parents. Parents are afraid, kids are afraid.
School officials say a student spoke up after finding a classmate with a book called Death Note. It's based on a Japanese anime cartoon where characters can write down the names of people who have wronged them, and the book has power to cause harm to those listed. Officials say the student's list had 17 names on it and was placed in the book.
Today I'm going to attempt to answer the question in the title of this video. Is Death Note dangerous? Death Note is one of the most popular animes of all time, for good reason. The story follows Light Yagami. One day, he stumbles upon a cursed book, an insidious creation that lets the user kill freely with no accountability or oversight. All that's required is a name and a face. We get to see a seemingly perfect child fall into madness based on his perceived power. People love this series for its stellar cast of characters, amazing animation, and one of the best detective narratives ever made. An approach that's the perfect inverse to the traditional storytelling structure. Rather than focus on a character like Sherlock, we dive deep into the mind of a killer. Everything's elevated to the next level by a soundtrack that can only be described as divine. Even the concept of the Death Note is such a gratifying idea for the audience. There are times when every one of us wishes we could take justice into our own hands. My boss is a horrible person. If only I had a Death Note. But even this idea entering our minds is horrifying to think about. Underneath a beautifully woven tale is a dark underbelly. Does Death Note tell the story of serial killers or glorify them? Light and Mikami are the obvious bad guys in the tale, although their depictions tell a different story. Think about when you see these two executing people. Epic music plays in the background. Dramatic, exaggerated motions take over the screen, a gleam of happiness in their eyes. A lot of these interactions are markedly different than the manga, so the arguments I make will be levied more at the anime. The differences in the ending are especially troubling. Tetsuro Araki's interpretation of Sugumi Oba's work is the problem. The original ending shows Light's mask coming off, a sniveling killer whose ego was shattered by his first loss. Although the anime almost gives Light a heroic send-off, melancholic music plays as he recalls the happier times in his life. Even his final moments take place on a staircase with a holy light shining through. To be fair, I don't think the director had the intention of glorifying killing. So what are the troubling elements of the anime? In a way, this series makes the act of murder look kinda cool, which is so harmful. Light and Mikami are often depicted as godlike figures. Death Note is usually one that people will recommend as a starter anime for good reason. At its core, this work is a psychological masterpiece. Constant tension permeates the air. We get meaningful internal dialogue for each character. Mikami and Light are two people with extreme versions of antisocial personality disorder, not confined by the law. Everything in Death Note is by design, but the interpretation of media is just as important as the intention. Teru Mikami is arguably the most dangerous element in both the manga and the anime. His character is bullied and harassed, so he develops a warped moral compass. Initially, it seems like his heart is in the right place.
Thank you, Teru.
Hearing those words of gratitude from the victims made me want to save them again and again.
Teru becomes a lawyer to defend the less powerful, but realizes he's in the same spot in life. Instead of trying out a new perspective, he slaughters people for Kira, almost implying that if life is terrible enough, killing is a viable option. His character is extra pernicious because of the reasoning he leads with. Light is driven by his internal moral compass. Given his circumstances, no one would suspect that he's Kira, which is such a poignant message about psychology. Although, Mikami is largely driven by circumstance. I've been extensively bullied throughout my life. There were times when I could genuinely empathize with this character when I was younger. I know I'm not alone in this feeling. There have been countless instances of children and young teens owning their own death note. Even a murder case in Belgium had the writing, "Watashi wa Kira desu." I've been pretty scathing in my critiques thus far, but to give a fair analysis, Oba's work is filled with so much educational value. Take for example, Misame. Misa looks emotionally destroyed when she uses the death note. Her moral compass is being torn apart. Kira doesn't have the same struggle. He seems like he's on top of the world when his plan is in action. Light has no regard for life he deems unworthy. The stark contrast in their characters exemplifies this difference. Death Note also demonstrates how a reduction of empathy ultimately leads to a lack of humanity. Mikami and Light turn into monsters when they receive the Death Note. The more power they accrue, the less regard they have for those beneath them. The book itself is a direct contrast to empathy. Or how about the powerful commentary on levels of removal? Much of the murder in this show is thanks to the Death Note. The villainous duo talk a big game, but their slaughter comes from safety. They rarely put themselves in harm's way or kill directly. Physical distancing makes killing that much easier for every character. Without the Death Note, life would go on the same as usual. Dissecting these conflicting positions is genuinely difficult. I love Death Note and anime so much. Putting my biases aside for this video was a challenging process. The same is true for those of you watching. All I ask is that you listen to my point of view with an open mind and cast aside your love for anime as well. So today, I wanted to go over the finer details to see if Death Note is an educational masterpiece or a destructive piece of media. To be clear, I'll defend the right for Death Note existing to my dying breath, but I think it's important to engage with the media we consume critically. I'm Very, as you sit back, take a potato chip and eat it, don't forget to hit the sub button and notification bell so you always see my latest content. I think the best place to start this video is by analyzing the Death Note as a concept. An evil tome allows you to kill anyone you want as long as you have their name and can visualize their face. If you write down a cause of death, then it can happen within the realm of reason. If no cause of death is written, then the victim dies from a heart attack. The user of this book is sentenced to a life of eternal suffering. Meanwhile, a Shinigami follows the person around, begging them for apples. So now that we got a basic understanding of what the book does, let's talk about its implications. One thing that makes Death Note so dangerous is levels of removal. Ned Stark talks about how a man who sentences another man to death should be the one to swing the sword. This quote is a poignant commentary about our agency. If I'm willing to take someone else's life from them, I don't deserve to be insulated from the mental consequences. When we can kill unfettered, life ceases to have meaning. If I despise my coworker, I won't act based on the repercussions of the law, but also, I don't want to hurt someone else. Although, this isn't the case for everyone. Some people act solely based on the confines of the criminal justice system. The Death Note is the perfect tool to circumnavigate this process. Access to the ability to kill without associated consequences. The Death Note is nothing more than power itself, but access to this resource can often lead to a lack of empathy. Someone who is uber wealthy doesn't usually stop to think about their engagement with the financial system. The same can be said in the case of Kira. Let's imagine we have the Death Note. We hate our teacher. One day, we decide to write their name down and move on. If we only operate in this way, such a terrible device doesn't feel reprehensible. Although, if you think of the consequences of our actions, then our empathy naturally kicks in. What about the family Stephanie has? Her children will never see their mother again. All these people's lives will be destroyed by one choice. But without the levels of removal that come with the Death Note, the idea of murder never even crosses our minds. Becoming a Shinigami is only enticing when we live free from the repercussions of our choices. What does the Death Note mean in terms of accountability and anonymity? One of the easiest ways for humans to deal with responsibility is to cast blame. The Milgram experiment demonstrates this phenomenon. In a study, participants are told to shock a person if they answer a question wrong. The one conducting this experiment isn't allowed to make threats or be overly persuasive, with the explicit goal of seeing how far a person will go. The one receiving the shock is only a recording, but this isn't revealed until afterward. Interestingly, more than half of the participants were shocked to the highest percentile, even though the recordings begged them not to.
Take it off! I've had enough of this!
When asked why, they said they were following orders. Real-life historical events like the Nuremberg trials reinforce this idea. As humans, we don't like taking responsibility. Not to mention, the world of Death Note uses hierarchical structures as well. L is ultimately responsible for the side of justice until Mello and Nier take over. They take accountability for the deaths that happen under them. This is an example of taking responsibility. If we look at the side of destruction, things are different. Light isn't taking the fall for anyone. Mikami won't turn himself in, even if his god is captured. This is ultimately why the side of justice prevails in the end. Understanding that we could harm another is a horrible feeling, but recognizing our part in the harm equates to meaningful growth. Nier and Mello use their pain and perspective to gather insight. Light's lack of empathy and accountability lead to his downfall. Another idea the Death Note puts forward is anonymity. In the Milgram experiment, many were shocked to the fullest extent, but could they follow through if the person was in front of them? Shocking someone or writing a name on the Death Note is a lot easier when there isn't a face behind the action. When we think about it, Kira's ultimate goal is to remain anonymous. When someone sees our face, we aren't a stranger to them. They have an idea of who to cast blame onto if that person wrongs them. But remove these things and the world becomes dangerous. Death Note is a show focused on preserving anonymity. Light's entire goal is to remain anonymous. One of the most powerful lines for me is when Nier tells the antagonist that he's nothing but a murderer. At the end of the day, Light isn't special or divine. He was gifted a horrible device that allowed him to kill others. But when you strip it all away, Kira is just a spoiled high school brat that never matured. Both Kira's access to the Death Note inflates their egos beyond belief. Power, ego, and empathy have a unique relationship with one another. Everyone has their interpretation, but to me, ego is the perceived power that one has. For example, people who use heavy psychedelics often experience ego death, a momentary loss of self, cast into a powerless state of consciousness. Think about all the things you can do. The power to read or write, or even something simple like eating a chip. Take away all these features and then ask yourself, who am I? Light doesn't think he's a god before the Death Note, even though he has divine circumstances, perfect grades, a loving family, and popular with the ladies. A life that so many would be envious of. But the moment he gets a little taste of power, he runs wild with it.
I will become the god of this new world.
His sense of self is off the charts, although his abilities are more limited than his self-perception. Light's ego is ultimately his downfall. He truly believes he's beyond even the mighty Shinigami, untouchable. Access to power impacts our ability to empathize. Mikami's character is filled with compassion until he receives the Death Note. He doesn't have to worry about the same defenseless people as before. They aren't relevant to his life because he's operating on a different strength level. But those lives he defended matter. Also, the concepts we talked about previously distance the characters even further from empathy. Anonymity and non-accountability symbolize different forms of protection. These three powers in tandem send Light and Mikami down a path of destruction. Both antagonists demonstrate how power can change our moral compass. As a quick tangent, I think it's interesting to think about the Death Note as the chicken or the egg conundrum. Did the main character become a killer because he gained power, or did access to power let him show the world who he truly is? When Light and ex-Kira are captured, we get to see their egos die in real time, the realization that their lives are over. Light Yagami is an amazing character study. We don't often get to peer into the mind of a killer, especially in terms of internal dialogue.
Well, that's fine. Everyone here dies today, thanks to you. And as for me, I, Kira, will have my perfect victory.
What makes The Red Dragon a far more engaging read than Silence of the Lambs is Will Graham. His ability to get into the murderer's headspace makes the premise more engaging. The same sentiment is true in Death Note. Light Yagami's most heinous thoughts are on full display. His incessant urge to dish out justice, or the gleam in his eyes when we hear him guffaw about his latest murder. Understanding a character's motivation helps to ground them in reality. When a character we love does something batshit in a show, it can be upsetting. Why did they do this for no reason? With Light's character, we never have this problem. Not to mention how much tension the cat and mouse elements add to the show. When shit hits the fan, we can see the cracks in his mask, the unveiling of something more insidious right below the surface. All these elements help us get invested in Light, which is a challenging thing to do as a writer. Kira isn't relatable for most people. He's an exemplar person in all walks of life, so Oba had to create some way for us to get on board with his plight. Internal monologues excel for this reason. We always know what Light is going to do and why. So if Kira is unrelatable and a killer, how did he gain such a cult following? Internal dialogue does something else in Death Note than just adding context. Light's worldview is something that we can imprint on. Not to the same degree, of course, but varying extents. Every one of us has woken up to injustice in the world, wishing that we had more power to change society in a meaningful fashion. Both Kira's version of reality lacks true justice. To judge something fairly, we must have complete context around the situation. When Mikami sees a killer, their life circumstances or intentions are of no concern to him. One concept from psychology can help combat this idea. The last thing we want is to cultivate similar thoughts to Kira. The fundamental attribution error is the tendency to overemphasize personality-based explanations for others, but make context-based excuses for our own behaviors. Shinagamis kill others with ease because they don't take time to empathize. If Light was born into a poor family in a rough neighborhood, would he still become Kira? Taking the time to think outside ourselves can stop us from acting in a harmful manner. We can see how easy it is to turn a blind eye to others' hardships when we get a little taste of power. Kira's biggest feeling is his overinflated ego. To say he thinks he's better than others is an understatement. Light believes he is the god of this world, even above the Shinigami that could take his life in a second. If both Kiras symbolize inflated egos, then their equivalent on the good side would be L and Mello. Both Mello and L interact somewhat based on ego. Mello wants to one-up his competitor and prove his worthiness. L hates losing and takes liberties based on his intuition. Nier is the only character who can cast his ego aside for the greater good. He is willing to work with his enemy. He doesn't care about victory, only that Kira is brought down. When Light and L interact, they are focused on their skin in the game. I will defeat Kira. I will defeat L. The focal point is on their goals, but also themselves. A perfectly curated landscape is set before Nier. He understands the ego-driven nature of Kira and uses that to his advantage. The mysterious man behind the monitor was the only one to get under his skin. L's successor is aware of another key detail that seals Light's fate. Yagami doesn't want to consider the fact that he could be outsmarted, that a ragtag team of do-gooders could destroy God himself. Oba's work is a striking commentary about how our perceived sense of power can destroy us. After he attains more power, his ability to introspect is destroyed. But introspection was his only chance of enacting his goal. In a way, might is antithetical to our happiness and sense of purpose. The more our egos run rampant, the less we appreciate the smaller details in life. Light's cult of followers helps ground Death Note in a meaningful way. One of the things that gives an idea power is the people behind the thought. If everyone believes God is fake, then the conception of a higher power ceases to exist. The same is true for Kira. Light has one gift that Mikami doesn't, a cult of personality. Some genuinely believe that God has come to Earth to enact justice against the villainous. Even though Kira is just a concept, the power to kill unrestrained is so great that the world bends to his will. Illustrating this idea can be disorienting. We almost get gaslit for a second into whether this work is fiction. Light acts similarly to some of the worst offenders. He creates a dictatorship where he alone determines malevolence versus righteousness. Light has a massive sway when it comes to mass media. One message from Kira can send a wave of fear that reverberates across the globe. Not to mention, he builds a coalition around a unifying cause. We have to stop crime and destroy criminals. Although, the truly terrifying element is Light's charisma itself. He uses all tactics to sway people to his side, whether it be with sexual charm, intellectual manipulation, or emotional coercion. To form a cult of personality, one has to win over the people. Light exudes confidence. Every word that leaves his mouth is calculated and effective. Think about how much every character sacrifices for him, even though he sees them as pawns.
You idiot! I give you strict orders not to make any unnecessary movements until today!
Misa shortens her lifespan twice and goes on a killing spree. Takada kills Mello and gives up her life as well. Even Mikami sacrifices his future for the ideas that Kira put forth. A cult of personality requires charisma, but also an air of uncertainty. What will our leader do next? What are his end goals? There is no ambiguity for us, the audience, but a lot of fuzziness for the characters themselves. No one knows if Kira is actually a god or just a fool pretending to be one. Yagami's character is specifically designed to win over the audience. He's smart, charismatic, and handsome. All these traits are features that people tend to look for in a partner. As audience members, these qualities help us invest in Light. When Kira outsmarts someone, we relish the sophisticated way in which he did it. Our feelings towards Light grow with time, but this is by design. Oba constructed a despicable character who does the most heinous shit possible, but also is so well written that we can't help appreciate his cunning. Stockholm Syndrome is the idea that if we stay with an abuser for long enough, we might develop feelings for them. When we step back and look at all that's happened, Light is horrible. Although, if we focus on individual instances, his tactics are pretty badass. He comes up with possibly the best plan of all time, completely duping everyone even though he's murdered thousands. When Kira gets the notebook, we want to see what happens next. Our eyes are glued to the screen. We're so invested in this psychopath's killing spree that we can't stop watching. Death Note takes a horrible person and manages to make them palatable to a general audience. Whether we want to take him down or see him succeed, our investment grows the more time we are forced to spend with him. Light and Mikami both hold the title of Kira, but their differences are important to point out. The original Kira doesn't have an extrinsic motivation to be a murderer. He's got a stellar life before the Death Note. But Mikami is different. His life is filled with tragedy and despair, constantly harassed for standing up for what's right. Losing his mom at a pretty young age. The events in his life help him build a justification for his worldview, but that critique will come in time. The point I'm trying to establish is that Mikami has circumstantial reasons for his murder. His unbending sense of justice leads him to Kira in the first place. Sickened by the state of the world and his powerlessness, he resorts to killing. Mikami's tragic life circumstances make his character more relatable than Light. We can all imagine how nice a classroom would feel with no bullies in it, although this relatability stops once his morals come in. Ironically enough, Mikami largely ignores the pain and suffering of others in his pursuit of justice. Both characters are horrible, but Kira uses intent as his baseline. Light wouldn't kill someone who made a mistake and caused a fatal car accident, which to be fair isn't much better, but punishing accidental crime is extreme. Mikami only cares about people like him, the ones who incur harm in the pursuit of justice. That's why he doesn't consider intent, because any harm is equivalent in his mind. The one who is suffering doesn't care why the person killed their mom. Oba is warning us of the dangers of a cult of personality. Mikami is a more extreme version of Light who built his framework off a pre-existing model. One of my favorite topics discussed in Death Note is the idea of parasocial relationships. A parasocial relationship is a perceived connection one has to someone they haven't physically met. Let's use those who are subbed to my channel as an example. I might comment on one of your comments, which is a form of social validation. If you like my personality or my content, you might feel like I'm talking directly to you. Unfortunately, This isn't the case. I care a lot about my community, but I don't personally know you. Understanding this, I have to try and moderate my platform the best I can. My goal in these interactions is to ensure we have a healthy relationship between creator and consumer. Light goes out of his way to do the opposite. Mikami and Light's relationship is parasocial for the majority of Death Note. This worshipper has a very unhealthy relationship with his idol. He sees himself as chosen, a divine soldier in the war for justice. Mikami shows the dangers that come from parasocial interactions.
God recognized me, as I had always hoped. Not only that, but he found me worthy of sharing his power to eliminate evil.
Light doesn't give a shit about any of his followers' well-being. While he gains glory and acceptance, his disciples sacrifice all they have. Part of what makes this interaction so sad is that Mikami seems like a person who is never truly recognized. No one accepts his warped view of the world. His ideas are constantly shut down by the social resources in his life. Without any support system, he turns to an online figure, someone who agrees with the beliefs he already has. Light takes advantage of this dynamic whenever possible. Parasocial relationships lack the social advantages, but retain the manipulative elements. Mikami cares about Kira and the world he's trying to create. It's important to note that the Shinigami follower still acts horrible and deserves condemnation. Our demented killer sees this insecurity and exploits it for personal gain. Unfortunately, Mikami isn't Light's only victim. Misame isn't like Mikami or Light. At her core, she's only driven by her love for Kira. Misa is the polar opposite of the other Kiras because she isn't self-motivated. She was willing to give up half her lifespan twice in the pursuit of love. Portraying dichotomous characters is important to highlight the extent of Light's manipulation. His exploitation in this circumstance is even worse because the parasocial becomes social. Physical contact is so important for our mental health. Something small like a hug can make a huge difference to someone in need. But when you mix in personal feelings, these experiences are elevated. A hug from my girlfriend cheers me up more than a stranger. Misa's relationship with Light shows how idolization can lead to exploitation. As I said earlier, the manga and anime have meaningful differences, especially for Misa's character. I actually prefer the anime's adaptation of Misa, but the manga's ending is pretty realistic. In the original, after Kira is killed, Misa leaves society. Way up in the mountains, she forms a coalition with other devout followers who worship Kira to this day. Sugumi Oba highlights the lasting effects that can come from parasocial relationships and a cult of personality. Even though Kira hasn't killed in a while, these people will still follow him to the death. Their belief in his ideas and values has a lasting effect on the population. The anime takes a different approach with Misa. Many remember the scene where she sings a song while executing people. I love the introspective details throughout this tune. Misa walks through the city looking at random people, children who she might one day execute if they resort to crime. Even the lyrics are asking for guidance. In this interpretation, Misa is shown as a more sympathetic character, almost asking, is all the harm I inflicted worth it for true love? What do I do when life has no meaning? Especially since Light did so much for her when she was emotionally volatile. All she wanted was vengeance, but she got roped into something that she was having second thoughts about. I love this interpretation, because Misa seems like she does care about others to some extent, so the idea of using the Death Note eats away at her conscience, which makes her a more relatable character. Misa, Aizawa, and Matsuda make the anime and manga feel more realistic. They are human characters. I've never met anyone remotely similar to Nier or Light, but I've known many Misas. Including more one-dimensional characters adds layers of nuance. Think about it like this. If every person were similar to Light, Mellow, or L, would the show be interesting in the same way? Part of what makes Death Note so gratifying is the humanistic elements. Kira is so engaging because of the way he manipulates everyone. Someone hyper-skeptical like L would never fall into his trap, but a person blinded by love is a pawn to be used. Misa also helps keep the audience empathetic. We are largely distanced from the murderers just like Light. Most of the time, we are insulated from the consequences of his actions. Occasionally, we will see suffering, but it's not the focal point. Without experiencing the pain of loss firsthand, we can become callous to death to some extent. When we see Misa suffering, instantly we remember what's at stake. She is still culpable for her actions, similar to Mikami, but her situation is extra tragic. Light fakes complete physical and psychological investment for personal gain. Now that we've covered the groundwork, let's reinterpret the story. Light Yagami finds a mysterious book of power called the Death Note. Granting him access to strength, he uses this tool. As his god complex starts to take over, his ability to empathize is gone. Things seem perfect, but his arch nemesis, L, makes an appearance. This mysterious figure is cream of the crop when it comes to detectives. Instantly, he gets under Light's skin, a person with comparable smarts who doesn't fear him like everyone else. L is operating from a similar baseline. He's the god of the criminal justice world, always able to solve a case. A curated prodigy. Light and L have an uncanny similarity, but a challenge to Light's ego is something he cannot accept. As Kira purges the world of criminals, L stays hot on the pursuit. Eventually, they size each other up in person. These two are zealous in the pursuit of their goal, to ensure the good guy wins, to create a world with only good people. Light eventually runs into Misa. Her parents were murdered, but our favorite Shinigami got justice for her. As a result, she idolizes him. Together, they wreak havoc, killing in unprecedented numbers. The world lives in complete fear. L gets more aggressive in his pursuit and imprisons both Misa and Light. Relinquishing their ownership of the Death Note, their memories are wiped. It's important to recognize, L is in an incredibly challenging situation. He has to solve a supernatural case where Shinigami exist, pitted against a brilliant killer with a fully loyal second in command. Eventually, Light wins in the battle of wits and ego. These two are the natural heirs to L's legacy. Mello still has the same ego drive as L, but it ends up working in our favor. Nier is the only one who can look past themselves for the greater good. He uses the ego battle between L and Light to his advantage. As the new leader of the police force of Japan, Kira has to be sneaky. He contracts the help of Mikami and Takada. Again, using the power at his disposal, he manipulates those around him. Nier and Light continue taking shots at each other, but something feels different.
This strange feeling. What is it?
This kid has unshakable confidence in his conviction. A person with no ego is the natural counter to someone with an overinflated one. For a while, Light evades the law, but as L predicted, the good guys win in the end. They corner Mikami and Light. Both their masks come off in their final moments. Nothing hurts Light worse than the moment when Nier calls him a murderer. His ego couldn't take the blow. Before we begin criticizing Death Note, I think we should first sing its praises. One thing this series does expertly is deconstructing psychology. Let's start with Light. If we look at his circumstances, we'd never assume he's Kira, but that's kind of the point of mental health. An ideal living situation doesn't necessarily equate to mental well-being. I think it's safe to say that the Shinigami and his disciple both suffer from an antisocial personality disorder. Someone who has this disorder has no concern for what's right or wrong. When we look at the list of symptoms, we get a better understanding of the characters. Using charm or wit to manipulate others for personal gain or personal pleasure, hostility, significant irritability, agitation, aggression or violence, unnecessary risk-taking or dangerous behavior with no regard for the safety of self or others. Light's internal monologue helps this concept take physical form.
If I answer him based on my feelings alone, it'll only make me look worse to everyone.
We can see what these symptoms look like as ideas manifest into reality. It's important to remember that Mikami and Light have ultra-extreme versions of this disorder. Another element that elevates Death Note is the commentary about our relationship with media. The content we consume can dramatically impact our worldview and perception. Even though the information being conveyed is just pixels on a screen, our mental health still responds. People live in total fear in the world of Death Note. Many walk with their heads down. They don't want to interact with Kira by accident. Everyone is extra careful to not come close to even thinking about crime. The environment in this series resembles a surveillance state to some extent. No one knows how Light's powers work. Constant anxiety looms over everyone across the globe. If Kira can access people's thoughts, is even thinking about crimes punishable? I think Oba is inserting powerful commentary into how much media impacts our mental health. A heartwarming video can make our day. An introspective film can make us question our place in the world. Or a terrifying figure can strip us of agency. The atmosphere isn't that much different than in the book 1984. Big Kira is always watching. Fear is a powerful force that changes the way we act. Or how about all the gaslighting?
Because I'm Kira.
In psychology, gaslighting is when a person tries to have another question what's real. They might use misleading information or act in an emotionally manipulative manner. Our pretend hero hates his enemy with every fiber of his being, or so it seems. We have the benefit of hindsight, but look at their reactions. Initially, some don't believe it's true. What's scary to think about is that this phenomenon is by design. Light intentionally gaslights the people around him so he can kill unrestrained. He makes those in his life question if reality is real. Gaslighting is a horrible thing to do to someone and can result in devastating consequences. Misa loses the majority of her life and spends her last years chasing Light's former glory. Naomi got tricked into giving up her name after her husband was murdered. Another person who shows us the effects of harmful relationships is Mikami. Kira frames himself as a Shinigami, but in reality, he's an abuser. Parasocial relationships aren't necessarily unhealthy, but they have a lot of potential danger. When a person is your friend in real life, you get an understanding of how much they value you. How often you talk or interact with someone is meaningful information. With online interactions, it can be harder to gauge personal investment. Text can't convey tone in the same way as spoken language and facial expressions. We also have no way to gauge personal investment. This person messages me a lot. Am I important to them? When they log off the screen, are they still thinking about me? One drawback is that parasocial relationships feel more intimate than they really are. A person you look up to talking to you is a gratifying feeling. Light uses this fact to destroy Mikami's mind. He goes back and forth between praise and veiled threats, which is abuser tactics 101. Mikami idolizes Kira, but he never knows where he stands. Yagami wants his followers to know their place and how expendable their life is. But Mikami isn't fully aware of this fact. He believes that Light is a god and specifically chose him. When you spend a lot of time with a person, you can find out pretty quickly they aren't God. Although, if I see someone who can kill on command without knowledge of the Death Note, that's a different story. Mikami shows us in real time the outcomes of abuse and parasocial relationships. Ex-Kira has thrown away his successful life for a childish murderer. Even the supporting cast embodies psychology. Take Mello for example. He perfectly encapsulates toxic masculinity. He's fiercely independent, hyper-competitive, and very physically aggressive. Whenever he's around, there's lots of anger, explosions, and mayhem. I appreciate Mello a lot. I think he's got a standout character design, and it's fun to see a more off-the-wall version of L. Light works around the confines of reality by using the Death Note. This book defies everything we know. So Mello is a nice addition on the side of justice to even out the playing field. Rather than work in the confines of the law, he goes unhinged, although Mello's toxic masculinity defeats him. He repeatedly puts himself in dangerous situations because he refuses to work with Nier. With Nier's brain and Mello's street smarts, Kira could have been taken down that much quicker, but pride gets the best of him. I always appreciate a narrative where the humans outside the story still uniquely impact the world. In Hero Academy, the cheers of society give Endeavor the strength he needs to keep fighting. Or in Attack on Titan, the fear on an average person's face shows how menacing the Titan's presence can be. In Death Note, Citizens adds so much to the psychological world building. The Cult of Kira is a genius inclusion into the universe. I have problems with the glorification of Light in Death Note, but there's no denying that if Kira existed, a wave of followers would be a likely reality. Many believe that Kira's power is the Death Note, but this isn't true. Light's true power comes in the form of fear. He can manipulate society to his will by using the idea of death as leverage. When we think about Death Note, I feel like it's often about individual interactions. Damn, I can't believe Light did that to Misa. How did Light think up something so clever? Kira is operating on the macro level. He's not just gaslighting and abusing those he comes into contact with. Light is targeting the world. Humans help powerfully convey this idea. Instead of everyone having universal fear, like an attack on Titan, society is morally conflicted. Some want to see the reality that Kira is cultivating. Others succumb to his will through fear. One final thing Death Note excels at is deconstructing fear itself. Understanding the origins of our worries or anxieties is important. Without knowledge of our issues, it's easy to misdirect our troubles. Fear or bigotry often stems from a lack of understanding. People cower under Kira because of his ambiguity. No one understands how the Death Note works or what his end goal is. The average person is deeply upset by the state of the world. Since they can't combat the idea of Kira, he offers them another solution. Turn your focus towards the criminals. They are your real enemy. I only kill because they exist. Light uses uncertainty to shift everyone's focus. Also, they are mortified that they might have to resort to crime and end up in the same place. The Death Note is a weapon of mass destruction, but fear can be every bit as powerful. I think to begin, we should talk about how media can be harmful. Content that glorifies harm can lead to harm in the real world. As much as I love gaming, there is a link between games and violent tendencies. The same is true for other types of media as well. As audience members, we try our best to responsibly engage with art, but this process is honestly difficult. So many factors influence the way we engage with media. Our mental health, the social resources we have in our lives, and how much we empathize with a certain character. Every piece of media has the potential for harm, but it's a sliding scale. For example, we wouldn't want to make a movie that glorified Hitler's achievements and disregards the countless horrors he orchestrated. Some people could walk away after watching and think, wow, Hitler's kinda awesome, which is the last thing we want. Part of gauging the harm is by analyzing the reactions of those who consume art. If enough people are starting to get the wrong idea, then we have to ask, is this piece of media okay? But this is a challenging question to answer. Humanizing characters is a potential area for harm. Tony Montana from Scarface is a cold-hearted killer with a tragic past. Suffering from extreme oppression and poverty, he climbs the ranks in the mafia scene. Giving him a relatable backstory has both positive and negative elements. On one hand, it shows us how our environment impacts our worldview. Tony wants everything because he's used to having nothing. But on the other hand, lies a lot of potential harm. Those with similar experiences may look up to Tony or relate to his suffering. They might act similarly to achieve their end. So what elements make Death Note harmful? To begin to answer this question, we need to make distinctions between Tsugumi Oba and Tetsuro Araki. The manga does have harmful elements, but the anime is much worse. The first thing the anime does poorly is make the act of killing look cool. I understand that as a medium, anime has to be more eye-catching, so some level of flair is required to keep an audience. But Death Note almost glorifies killing. In the manga, the infamous chip scene is very subdued. These panels illustrate that murder is an everyday part of Light's routine that doesn't require much focus. Similar to taking notes, he's casually taking lives while having a snack. In the anime, these same interactions are ridiculous. Dramatic pen motions, over-the-top music, and palpable bloodlust. Setting the tone in this way makes Light look badass. The vibes are almost of an artist creating art. When the killing starts to look sexy or cool, on some level, it normalizes this idea to us. Everyone loves the scene when Scarface blows everyone away, but those epic kills are human beings. Without a healthy engagement with media, these lines can get blurry. Speaking of humanizing Light, what about his send-off? I had never read the Death Note manga before creating this video, but I was shocked by the differences in the ending. In the manga, Light is sniveling, falling apart at the seams. He begs Ryuk not to die. He not only gets his just desserts, but his illusion is dispelled from the audience. We know how pathetic he is under the facade. Kira breaks down in Araki's version as well, but in a more pernicious manner. Light walks for a long time, remembering all the meaningful moments in his life he took for granted while somber music plays. This on its own would be a bit sketchy, but acceptable. What gives off a bad message is Light dying on the staircase. Beautiful rays of sunshine pour over him in his final moments. Throughout the end credits, we get similar scenes showing Kira in a heavenly manner. Not to mention, Misa is lost as a person. Endings like this leave the viewer unsure of how to feel. Kira is a murderer, but seeing him go this way is so sad. People worshipped him. The depictions of killing made him look so confident. But if we teleport back in time to the beginning of it all, he killed thousands of people because he was bored in school. Mikami is yet another problematic element in both the manga and the anime. Mikami is very similar to Scarface. He's given a sympathetic plight, an unchanging worldview, and a want for power. Kira is pretty unrelatable. Most of us don't have a perfect life, let alone a death note. But many of us have felt Mikami's pain, targeted harassment, unrelenting social pressure to live a certain way. Kira's danger comes from his humanization. When I was younger, I could relate a lot to this character. He's felt the same pain as me. This relatable feeling was problematic. But what's worse is the implication. We know his life is sad, but do his circumstances justify his behavior? The answer is obviously no, but as audience members, the line gets blurry. To reiterate, these instances are worse in the anime, but Mikami is one of the more harmful elements in general, which adds salt to the wound, because his character is also filled with powerful psychological commentary. Or how about the citizens and supporting cast? While it's true, they add a grounded realism to Death Note, the glorification of Kira is still worrisome. We talked about how the ending of the anime has troubling elements, but when you contextualize this with the idolization of Kira, things become complicated. When watching the anime, I think it's not unreasonable to say that we empathize with Light on some level. Not his actions, but his plight. We've all had times when we wish society could do more. So already, we have this as our primer. Then, we see a large swath of people who support the self-proclaimed god. Misa is already head over heels for him. Even characters like Matsuda say things like Kira wouldn't do something so uncool. After he commits countless crimes, we get this scenic retelling of his life. When you compile all these pieces of evidence, it almost serves as a counterbalance to his malicious actions. We've talked a lot about the side of evil, but even the side of justice gets its hands dirty. If you were me when watching Death Note, you were hooked, wanting to see what happens next, hoping that someone will finally outsmart Kira. But in this zealous pursuit for closure, we often overlook a lot of harm done by the police. Elle and Mello both partake in harmful measures to achieve their ends. Mello goes around the law countless times to get his hands on a Death Note, kidnapping people, implicit threats, and creating explosions. These behaviors aren't legal and put others needlessly in danger. Nier is explicitly against these decisions for this reason. His moral code is to try and do things on the books, similar to his mentor, although L took some liberties as well. He imprisoned 2 people against their will with pretty shaky evidence for an extended time. Even though the police are going against the Shinigami, there are codes of conduct they must follow. Speaking of Shinigami, the anime's depiction of Light and Mikami as godlike figures is troublesome. Whenever these two kill, things become dicey. Kira finally becomes the god of this world. After taking down L, no one stands in his path. He goes on a tirade, finishing up loose ends. I'll start the creation of this new world. The music booms in the background, his hands shake in anticipation. A flurry of pen slashes dances across the screen. They even give him the badass anime eyes at it. The same can be said when Mikami executes people.
Delete, delete, delete.
I mean, come on. There are moments when it looks like he's using an ability in Genshin Impact. Depictions such as these further confuse the audience. They are doing something horrible, but it looks so epic and stylized. Not to mention that these two present as godlike figures to everyone else. Light stands above the world, dealing out punishment. Mikami watches from afar as his enemies drop like flies. One of the terrifying things about media is how much it can influence our perception. Death Note is a fun anime to watch and discuss, but when fiction becomes reality, we have to have a broader conversation. Ever since its conception, Death Note has become a cult classic. Some of the most diehard fans still exist to this day. Hell, my girlfriend is one of them. Having discussions about the series can be entertaining. Creating your own Death Note is a different story. Many students have been found with their own versions of this cursed book. While some are in good fun, a number go into excruciating detail. A few instances had names of faculty members and classmates written down. Just like in Death Note, even the thought of harm puts students and parents in a panic. Most of the time the kid is joking, but the receiver isn't aware of this fact. The scariest real-life example was a case in New Hampshire. A young girl was found with a notebook with multiple students' names written in it. She went into explicit detail about how they would be killed. After this event, many students felt fear about returning to class. Luckily, nothing happened in these different cases, but it's not a good look. The fact that many kids felt comfortable owning one sets a scary precedent. Actions ultimately spawn from ideas, and here lies the true danger in Death Note. Some kids brought some books to school. So what? Well, how about the countless people online who agree with Kira? While it's hard to gauge just how much support there is, it's not hard to find those who argue Light's actions are acceptable. Countless accounts sing Kira's praises. These ideas can be dangerous to foster. If we start thinking that a Shinigami is righteous, then real-world harm can materialize. One murder case in Belgium illustrates the damage. This case was coined the manga murderer because the crime scene had a note left nearby. Body parts were found next to a piece of paper that read, "Watashi wa Kira desu." Translated, "I am Kira." Media is such a powerful thing that impacts so many of us. A good book or movie can grant us powerful perspective. Although, a harmful piece of content can lead to material damage. People lost their lives, which isn't something to be understated. The short answer to this question is yes, but it depends. I know that might sound like a shocking response, but everything is contextual. The way we interpret anime, games, or movies is largely dependent on how we go into them. If we are feeling sad, a game about depression might resonate with us. But if we are super happy, that type of content doesn't have the same weight. The same is true in regards to Death Note. The average person has a healthy engagement with this show. They watch or read and understand that Light is the antagonist. Whether they like his character or not, they know he needs to be taken down. Although, the room for misinterpretation is pretty high, especially in the anime. Say you go into Death Note frustrated by the world, feeling dejected and saddened by how your life is. You see a character like Mikami who embodies your moral framework to some extent. He's constantly shown in a hyped up way. Will watching an anime on a bad day turn you into a murderer? Most certainly not. But it can exacerbate a harmful mind space to be in. If a viewer does empathize with Kira, Death Note can feel gratifying in a way. Thank God someone is finally getting justice in this unfair world. Glorifying the act of killing is something that should be generally avoided in media. Depictions that show heinous acts in a positive way can cause real-world devastation. When more and more people believe in Kira's ideals, the idea of Light becomes palatable. After compiling the evidence, Death Note has a plethora of dangerous elements: glorifying murder, creating messiahs out of killers, and humanizing hatred. All things considered, I'd still recommend Death Note to the average person with one important caveat. Be aware of your mental state and worldview when watching this show. There's no denying the power of Oba and Araki's works. A grounded crime drama that dives deep into the minds of a killer forever shook the anime world. But part of this realism comes from the underlying thoughts. Many of us have horrible ideas at times. Given the power, in these moments, we might do unspeakable evils. Although, we can take a step back and analyze. Do I want to live in a world created through fear? Do I really want to harm someone I'm upset with in a lasting way a few weeks from now? Practicing mindfulness and conscientiousness when consuming media is so important. Trust me, I know from experience how easy it can be to get consumed by dark feelings. But in these moments, we must use empathy as our guiding light. Thanks for checking out this video. I really appreciate it. Also, if you didn't already, don't forget to hit that sub button and notification bell. Death Note is a masterpiece in terms of psychological design. Everything in this universe has an amazing attention to detail. From Light's gaslighting and antisocial personality disorder to the parasocial relationship he forms with Mikami. Even the average civilian is used to convey conflicting philosophical ideas. Not to mention Death Note's deconstruction of accountability, anonymity, and fear. That being said, we have to be aware of the ways we engage with media. Worshipping characters like Kira and Mikami can perpetuate harm in the real world. Humanizing the hateful can send a negative message to the audience. Understanding our relationship with media is crucial to avoid going down a similar path. What are your thoughts on this video? What do you think are harmful or positive elements in Death Note? I'd love to hear from you.